Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. Welcome to the LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogues. We are part funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Following the February escalation, LSE IDEAS launched the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues to explore how this conflict will impact on Ukraine, Russia, and the wider region and beyond. This dialogue is the 26th in this series, and so far we've brought together 78 government officials, military experts, and think tankers. We have focused on everything from heinous crimes and humanitarian issues to Black Sea security and the impact of this war on strategic arms control. This week's Russia-Ukraine dialogue, which coincides with the February escalation, will focus on Ukraine, the primary victim of this war. Since the February escalation last year, more than 7.5 million people have fled Ukraine, and nearly 7 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. According to the UN, this is the fastest forced population movement since the Second World War. Nearly 40% of Ukraine's population needs humanitarian assistance. To discuss these issues and Ukraine's military and economic needs, I'm very proud to announce that all our panelists are Ukrainian. Thank you for joining us. I would first like to welcome, allow me to introduce to our panelists first, Andrii Zuez, who is the head of the Office of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, the coordinating state body of the executive power under the President of Ukraine on issues of national security and defense. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Oleksandr Hryban, Deputy Minister of Economy of Ukraine. He is responsible for directing and coordinating performance of the Investment Department and the Department for Regulatory Policy and Entrepreneurship. Thirdly, I'd like to welcome Olga Tokariuk, an independent journalist, also a fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Then I'd like to also welcome Andrii Yarmolskyi, who is the deputy head of the Service for Foreign Policy Security and International Cooperation. He's also head of Sanctions Policy Department and a member of the Interdepartmental Working Group on the implementation of state sanctions policy. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mariia Zolkina, research fellow at the London School of Economics and head of regional security and conflict studies at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiative Foundation in Kiev. Welcome to all four of you. Today, we're going to change things around a little bit because our Deputy Minister, Oleksandr Hryban, unfortunately has to go to another meeting following this discussion. So I'll ask him a few questions before we turn to the other panelists. So Deputy Minister, if you could unmute for me, please. Firstly, in terms of economic and humanitarian cost of this war, how much damage has Russia inflicted upon Ukraine over the past year? Can you also talk to us about your fast-track recovery plan, which, if I understand it correctly, is the first phase of Ukraine's reconstruction? Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and I'm very honored and pleased to be speaking in front of such a great audience. And again, to use this platform as an opportunity to deliver the messages from Ukraine. If we talk about the damages from the war, of course, it's really hard to estimate them to the final extent because the war is still ongoing and the missile attacks are still hitting us. There were some preliminary milestones that we were fixing the damage, like in the subtotals, and the latest number that was recognized internationally was around 700 billion as a total damages. But I'm afraid this number is growing since then, and just recently, like the Ukraine's energy system has suffered 13 massive missile attacks and 15 drone attacks by Russia, and nearly 50% of the Ukraine's energy system has been damaged. More than 10 gigawatts of capacity are currently unavailable as a result of the Russian invasion. If we talk about the impact on the economy per se, so we're now fixing that the GDP has dropped for as much as 30.4%. although we managed to stabilize the macroeconomic stability to some extent, because the initial forecasts were around like 37-38% drop. So we managed to at least preserve some bits of the of this drop. And should the war end till the end of this year, at least the active phase of the war, because it's hard to believe that the passive phase, where was the missile attack threats, will still remain, will be over that fast. But should the active phase of war end this year, we would still anticipate some growth even. So we think that up to 2 or 3% growth is even possible in Ukraine. Although, again, as I said, the impact of the war is massive, and we just track and continue tracking and fixing those damages on literally the daily basis. In terms of like what efforts the government is doing and how do we putting the economy on the war track, in essence, we're destined now to work with the support of the big donors, and the donor financing is really vital and key for us. Is actually the foundation of everything, of all the economic activity at the moment. You may know that last year Ukraine managed to raise up to $36 billion to bridge the budget deficit. This year, our needs for just this basket for bridging the budget deficit are around 38 billion. And we can confirm that we've secured the majority of these funds with the help of the EU and US government. Yesterday, we had the mission from the IMF, and luckily there will be an announcement by the IMF management that the residual amount will be bridged by them. And of course, it's subject to us fulfilling a number of conditions, while the EU and US assistance was non-conditional, but the IMF nature is that they're actually trying always to keep the borrower mobilized, which is not always bad, and even in these conditions. So hopefully this will be covered, and we have other baskets that we're focusing on, which we're delivering to the donors through the multi-donor coordination platform that was initiated by the G7 countries. And the first top-level meeting and session has already happened, and that's where we presented all these three baskets. The first basket, as I mentioned, is the bridging of the budget deficit. The second basket is essentially the immediate recovery, because if we talk about the hundreds of $billions, this is the homework we will all be destined to perform during the decades from now. But we do have these immediate needs, which we can actually utilize this year. And if we talk about the infrastructure recovery, critical infrastructure, social infrastructure, like the bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, energy system infrastructure. So I think the estimation is around like 6 billion, and this is the second basket which has been presented to the multi-donor platform. And then there is a separate track for the demining, because this is a huge issue, and you know that it's normally the 1 year of war usually accounts for the 10 years of the demining. And that's what we are facing at the moment. Here we also have three different directions in which the demining should flow. First is the military demining, which is taken care of by the Ministry of Defense, and it's basically focused on regaining the territories, regaining the positions on the battlefield. The second one will be the critical energy infrastructure that is currently mined, and for instance, the liberated region of Kherson does not really have the full-scale energy supply because of that, and this is a big issue. And the third one will be the demining of the agricultural fields, and you know that Ukraine is one of the biggest agri producers, and this is also one of the critical points for us, and that's what we'll be looking for the support. And then the third basket of the big ones is the one that actually the Ministry of Economy is taking care of, is setting up some little more sophisticated financial instruments that will be triggering the multiples, and will be actually mobilizing the whole financial and capital market ecosystem. Here I'm talking about the things like political risk insurances for the investors, or I'm talking about the compensation of the interest rates for the small and medium enterprises, SME grant support fund, or like the support of the agri-producers, smaller scale farmers, because the small, micro, medium enterprises have usually been forming the basis of the Ukrainian economy, and these guys are like always the biggest contributors in terms of the taxes that have been paid, in terms of like jobs that were created. So we really want to focus on the support of those. And here we're asking the donors for this year to support us with circa $4 billion equivalent. But this thing, according to our estimates, and has been verified by the donors as well, is going to actually trigger up to 20 billion effect for the economy by means of mobilizing another leverage private capital. We're also here talking about the financial instruments from institutions like EBRD, IFC, that will be adding their own funds using the donor funds, but will also be adding the funds from their own liquidity. And this will also mobilize the equity from the borrowers, and as I said, create number of multiples.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. I think you've raised a number of important issues, and I definitely want to circle back to the issue of investors and how you try to source them in this very difficult time. But let me first ask you about this intimate relationship between the economy and security, which I think has not been more stark, at least not in recent years. Has Ukraine's economy been transformed into a proper war economy? And if so, can you describe it and talk to us about the major challenges in terms of that?
Well, it's happening every day essentially, and the first months of the war, we were, like producing the cabinet of ministers decrees every day. That is usually happening at least once a week. We had the government meeting every day. What we managed to do was we managed to provide the support for those enterprises that needed the relocation. More than 700 enterprises were relocated from the eastern part of Ukraine to the western part of Ukraine. Especially those that were very close to the battlefield, to the battlefront line. And that's where the government was assisting them to the full extent, providing the railway as the logistics partner, providing the local governments who can immediately assist them and start, absorbing their requests, etc., helping with utilities connection, which is like crucial and critical when you want to move the facility. Now we actually observe that the big component of those who moved to the west are now actually getting back, because it's like more natural for them to be in that ecosystem which they created, to be in that environment that was more friendly to them, and it's also about the employees, which is critical. The government has established the grant support programs for the processing industries, for the micro entrepreneurs, where the key criteria are actually the creation of the jobs. So we know that the jobs is actually a huge issue. The unemployment rate, I cannot give you numbers, but an official rate is like more than 30%. But this is like enormous figure, which is of course triggering all the negative consequences of the future and further potentially good implications for the GDP, like the consumer spending, consumer confidence is dropping. So that we still have a huge migration crisis. More than 5 million people still remain abroad, and in order to bring them back, we want to create the proper conditions, and of course start with infrastructure, critical infrastructure, then rebuild the residential infrastructure, and the third major component is to create the jobs. So the government is trying to support the economy, but it's also struggling because of this budget scarcity that I gave you the numbers on the beginning of my remarks. Having such a huge budget deficit is pretty difficult to continue supporting, the enterprises. What we managed to do is we managed to mobilize the fiscal program and as I said, to stabilize the monetary issues with the National Bank of Ukraine, has preserved the viability of the financial sector and of the banking system. That was working almost without the hiccups. Then we managed to preserve the currency in the country. So the foreign currency reserves is actually risen since the beginning of the war, and they are more than we had before the war. Yes, this is associated with a number of constraints, and like not all the enterprises are able to do the payments as they used to be to do freely when they want to do the abroad transactions, but it's all being regulated a little bit manually by the National Bank. But now we see already like the broad brush industries and spheres where these constraints are being gradually released. Like the servicing of the international borrowings are now released. It's always been the case with the IFIs, but now it's also getting to the commercial bank servicing. So these kind of things are gradually getting back to normal. But that was kind of the military mood that we managed to preserve. Then the mobilization of the male workforce and actually booking them from the mobilization, booking those guys who are critical for the economy, and working with those enterprises that are critical for the GDP. We actually managed to systemize this issue, and now it's like more transparent, and the enterprises know how to work with this, and they can essentially preserve and book those people who they need the most, and they will not go to army. So these are kind of major things that I wanted to touch.
Thank you. One of the things that you kept on bringing up is this issue of trying to fill the gap in terms of your budget deficit, and of course it is a big issue. You can't continue to fight a good fight in the absence of funding, not just military equipment, but also being able to sustain your population and of course your economy. So I guess a key question is, what is it like to source investments during wartime? And can you shed some light on President Zelensky's Advantage Ukraine project? Which investors are you targeting at present, and how do you promote risk management during this critical time?
Advantage Ukraine is the platform that has been initiated by the president, and that actually employs the former investment banking, private equity, and Big Four professionals that are supported by the USAID program. It's a special support program. These guys basically serve as the pro bono investment bank, and they're trying to educate the local initiators of the projects and try to make them more like compliable, bankable, explain to them like in which form the feasibility studies, financial models, pitch books, investment memos need to be prepared, and also working with the potential investors and lenders, sourcing and looking for both equity, debt, capital, M&A transactions, and with the major focus on the political risk insurance, because this is one of the key prerequisites and conditions in order for investors to start considering Ukraine. So having all these on board, like political risk insurance, equity, and debt financing that is also supported by the international finance institutions, having the concessional nature, sort of like a formula for success. As I said, we're still a little struggling with reinsuring the political risks, but this is where we're working closely with the donors, and I hope this framework will be finally fully set up, and the institutions like MIGA, DFC, and other export credit agencies like UCAF is also doing this, will be more keen to explore and expand their products. The industries we currently focus at predominantly are like the agri processing. For instance, we were the biggest agri producer, but we never had processing, and those logistics bottlenecks with the seaports pointed us out to this problem, and that's what we focus on. Energy, Ukraine can be the biggest renewable energy provider to Europe. The mineral resources, We have like 44 out of the 50 critical minerals that are required by the EU and US and UK. Like the gas deposits are huge. A lot of them are in the east and south, but there is a big deposit on the west, and it's unconventional gas. It needs a little like deeper exploration, but once it's done and can fully replace the gas volumes for Europe that were naturally coming from Russia. Information technologies industry is a huge one, and it's growing, and you know that Ukraine is famous for its level of digitalization and the startups. Logistics infrastructure, transportation is a huge perspective at the moment. Metallurgy, you know, like we have high deposits in the oxidized iron ores that are the prerequisite for the DRI, which is then the next step for the green metallurgy. So numerous opportunities out there, and we actually invite the investors to start considering them now, because the investment process is a time and effort consuming process. The sooner you start it, the better. And so it's still going to take you at least 6 to 7 months to do the due diligence, the audits, you know, the market survey. And so that's where we're there to help. That's where Advantage platform is to help. So the investors and those interested can actually leave an application through the platform, and they will be contacted by the professionals, and those guys will actually provide and find some relevant targets for them, and this may be a solution. So we're actually encouraging the investors to start considering Ukraine.
Thank you. I definitely hope we can talk more about those issues, you know, going forward. As you mentioned, even if the war ends tomorrow, the needs for Ukraine are still quite mammoth. But at the same time, there are major opportunities, like some of the ones that you've laid out. Deputy Minister, we'd like to thank you for your time. Also, I know you have to jump on another
Thank
call.
you. And I hope to be back, actually. Yeah, yes. I hope to be back, so I'll still try to catch up. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, so send in questions for us also, for our audience. Thank you. All right, thank you. Let's go now to Andrii Zuez and turn to the battlefield before we continue this discussion. A year ago, Putin thought he was going to send in his tanks for the full-scale military invasion, and that the war would be over in something like 2 weeks. Now, given how battlefield dynamics have evolved over the past year, how have your military goals changed and that of Russia? Thank you, Andrii.
Hello to everyone. First, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to join our discussion. The main thing I want to say is that nobody believed in Ukraine at first. Everyone supposed that we would resist only 1 week or so, and then transition to the phase of guerrilla warfare. This scenario influenced military and aid supplies in the first weeks and months of the war. To answer the rest of the question, we must first decide what the goals of the war are for Russia and Ukraine, and what is the definition of victory for both sides. As a result, it will be clear what kind of revolution the armed forces of Ukraine must go through in order to change the course of events in their favor and achieve the ultimate goal. Probably I will state too ambitiously, but as for now, Ukraine will no longer be satisfied with getting back to its own borders and even the return of Crimea, because the threat will not disappear. Russia and its TV-obsessed citizens will not go anywhere. We will not be able to keep our huge army on the borders all the time to deter further encroachments. Our victory is a change in the political system in Russia and its deformation. The free people of the Far East, the Caucasus, and everything that is unnatural for Russia, acquired as a result of its imperial policy, must become free and independent. The second important issue is depriving Russia of nuclear weapons. This is the concept of our victory for now.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to come back to you again on some of these issues that you mentioned. Let's first turn to Olga. Olga, if you could unmute for me, please. I know you also will only stay with us for a short matter of time, but it's great to have a journalist voice also on this panel, especially during this time of a lot of disinformation going about. And as you know, truth is it's said to be the first casualty of war. So from a journalist perspective, what are the three things that stick out for you from the past year since Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine? And what are the three things that you think were completely underreported?
Thanks so much, Leon. Thank you for organizing this event and thank you for having me. Well, you know, the things that stick out for me, I think many Ukrainians would share the sentiment, definitely, you know, the scale of Russian atrocities, what they've done in Bucha, what they've done in Mariupol, what they've done elsewhere in Ukraine when, you know, they were occupying Ukrainian territory. So I think there were some reports, the intelligence reports, also the UK intelligence, about Russia's plans ahead of the full-scale invasion. But I think very few believed that the level of atrocities that they would commit in Ukraine would be really equal in the level of atrocities committed in the World War II and unseen for decades in Europe. The second thing that I think was remarkable is Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian counteroffensives, very successful counteroffensives in Kherson and Kharkiv regions, when Ukraine unexpectedly for many and unexpectedly for Russia managed to liberate a big part of its territory. And the third thing is the consolidation of Ukrainian identity. And with this, I mean not ethno-linguistic identity, but political identity. You know, the fact that so many people embraced the identity based on values, on human rights, on, you know, struggle for its desire for freedom, for democracy. And I think this also brings me to your second question about the underreported things, because this third issue that I mentioned, it is important, it is there, most Ukrainians will agree with it, but I think it is still underreported. And other issues that I believe are underreported are, for example, the issue of the fact that this war is not something unusual, it's not something, a case, an isolated case. It's actually the continuation of the struggle of Ukrainians for independence, for their own free and independent state that has been going on for decades, for centuries. And I think there is still too little historical context in the reporting on Ukraine, and also too little awareness may be raised on the fact that this is an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist war, that Russia, you know, is clearly an empire that wants to return to its old days of glory, that doesn't see Ukraine and its other neighbors as independent states, sovereign states, that actually denies their right to exist. And I think there is maybe not enough awareness of that. And also another underreported thing, which I think is there, is how quickly Ukrainians manage to, you know, restore and rebuild things that are being destroyed by Russians. How quickly, even now, after several months and weeks of disruptions, of blackouts in Ukraine, that almost, you know, now it is almost not an issue, or it is not as acute as it used to be just like weeks ago. It's not because Russia is not attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure anymore. It's because Ukrainian emergency services are really efficient in repairing it. And the fact that also Ukrainians continue to, you know, live, adjust to this new reality and find so much, in a way, even normalcy in their life, even under these very difficult circumstances. The war is very often depicted as, you know, something like only the bad news, only the grim reality. Everyone is like crying all the time, and, you know, it's like only the heartbreak. But in fact, even at wartime, there are a lot of cases of inspiring stories of people's solidarity, of how people, you know, unite, how they help each other, how they restore things, how they you know, take care of their neighbors, of their friends, and even of complete strangers. I think maybe that's another underreported thing.
Thank you. Those are really great points, and you'll be happy to hear we'll have a specific panel dedicated two African perspectives also on this war, where we will try and flesh out this issue of Ukraine's anti-colonial / anti-imperialism struggle. Olga, let me just ask you also, over the past year, because your expertise also on disinformation, over the past year, how have Russian war narratives changed, both for the Russian audience, but also for the international audience?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And actually, we'll use this opportunity to advertise my upcoming piece on SIPA, dedicated exactly to this, to the analysis of Russian disinformation and its successes and failures in the past year. So, just to sum up, I would say that there are four groups of audience that Russia targets with this disinformation, and it's, the outcome of this disinformation operations are very different according to the different audience. So, first group is obviously the audience inside Russia, and there I think that the Russian propaganda machine is very successful. Very few Russian opposition media were forced out of the country. So basically inside Russia, there is very little access to objective information. And even, those Russians who might distrust the official propaganda machine, they still choose not to, act, not to rebel somehow to the regime and to the atrocities it is committing. So it is successful, at least in sowing despair and encouraging Russians to just be inactive, to just be passive, just to, not to do anything, even if maybe they do not support the war. Although, of course, a big part of Russians does support the war. The second audience is the Ukrainian audience. And here I think Russian disinformation operations have almost completely failed in the past year. Ukraine has developed very significant resilience to Russian propaganda and disinformation since 2014. Ukrainians know how this, how Russians operate, and the fact that Ukrainian media have done a tremendous job in reporting from the war, the fact that there was a constant, stream of news on major broadcasters who united their newsrooms to report on what is happening in the country, that ensured that people had access to reliable and verified information. Then the audience in the West is the third target group. And here again, I would argue that Russian efforts have largely failed. Russia failed to undermine the unity in the West and supporting Ukraine. Russia failed to convince the population in the Western and democratic countries, that its invasion had any justification and that there was any, valid reason for the atrocities that Russia has been committing. But it doesn't mean that these efforts would stop or, would not have effect in the longer run, because obviously Russia will continue its disinformation operations, aiming to undermine support for Ukraine, to sow disunity in the West, to start questioning where all the support that Ukraine is receiving is going to. It will try to discredit Ukrainian armed forces. Ukrainian government will try to depict Ukraine as a very corrupt, inefficient country. So we can expect that in the future. And the fourth group of countries and the audience that Russia targets is the audience in the global south. And here I would say Russia has been more successful than in other three target groups, in other two target groups, with the exception of Russian public. Because here Russia actually is playing this with this imperialist narrative, portraying itself as an anti-imperialist power and playing on the anti-Western sentiment, anti-NATO sentiment in many countries of the global south. It's also, manipulating the narrative of alleged racism in, treating Ukrainian refugees better than refugees and migrants from other countries. So I would say there's still a lot of work to do. And despite, in my opinion, the fact that Russian disinformation operations have not been successful in the past year, by and large, it's still too early to, relax and think that we are winning the information war.
Thank you, Olga. One very quick question before we let you go, because I know you have another thing that you need to attend. Given that you kind of touched on this when you laid out the different audiences, and one of the audiences that you mentioned is, of course, the Ukrainian audience. How important or how do you view the role of journalism in accurately reporting the Russia-Ukraine war? And perhaps you can touch on any of those audiences that you mentioned there.
Well, it's extremely important to have reporters on the ground. And of course, I mentioned the Ukrainian journalists who are doing, an incredible job in telling their own population what is happening and putting it into the context and analyzing it, despite all the challenges the journalists themselves are facing. At least 15 journalists were killed in the past year in Ukraine. This is according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And it's an underestimate, in fact. So many more journalists were wounded. About 200 media went bankrupt last year in Ukraine because of loss of advertising revenues and because of the Russian occupation. Some media on the occupied territories obviously were not able to continue operating. So despite all these challenges, I would say that Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian media have done a tremendous job last year. And of course, international journalists have also done an incredible job and continue doing that. I'm very happy that there are still international reporters who are in Ukraine, who are reporting from places such as Kherson, that is constantly being pounded by Russian artillery. Just today, at least 5 people were killed on a bus stop in Kherson. It's very important to keep the light, on those recently liberated territories as well. And because, the case of Kherson, for example, it illustrates why Ukraine is asking for, more weapons, why Ukraine needs to go on counteroffensive and liberate more of its territories, because just pushing back Russians to the left bank of Kherson doesn't really help to ensure safety for the residents in the right bank of Kherson, which is now under Ukrainian control, because they are within the reach of Russian artillery. Russia needs to be pushed out, from Ukraine completely. It needs to return to its own borders. And the journalists are doing an incredible job in explaining, what is happening, why this needs to happen. So I really want to thank and commend all my colleagues who've been risking their lives in Ukraine in the past year, and will continue doing that in the future.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you for your contribution and also the work that you're doing, as a member of the media to cover this war and trying to bring factual information to your different audiences. Thank you, Olga. Let's go to Mariia. Mariia, you have been studying this war since 2014, the Russia-Ukraine war. What are the main differences in terms of the start of this Russia-Ukraine war in 2014 and what we've witnessed since the February 2023 escalation? Thank you, Mariia.
Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you for this fascinating panel, extremely timely and important to enlarge actually their understanding of what the lessons of the first year for large-scale invasion and what's going to be expected ahead. Speaking about the differences between 2014 and 2022, I think that the first one was when it comes to international reaction, and Putin actually in 2022 expected that the reaction on his invasion of Ukraine will be similar to the reaction in 2014, when nothing actually was done in terms of hurting Russia in response to occupation of Crimea and beginning of the war with regular forces, but without insignia in Donbass. And Russia, and actually Russia was not mistaken from this point of view, because the first expectations on the side of those countries which later in several days started supporting Ukraine militarily, politically, economically, extremely effectively, they almost all expected that Kyiv would fall in several days. And that's why Kyiv was empty 1 year ago, was fully empty of foreign diplomats. As of now, we see that the situation is different, and president of the most effective democracy in the world has visited wartime capital, and is the biggest signal of what Ukraine has done, unfortunately at a huge price with the blood of our people, but what Ukraine has achieved over this year, that this capital is secure enough, let's say, for embassies to return, for diplomats and heads of the states and governments to come and to invest into military and political victory of Ukraine. Second important difference is that back in 2014, both Ukraine and its Western partners believed that diplomacy would work. And Ukrainian society, by the way, during 8 years of the war, I was conducting numerous public opinion polls regarding conflict-related issues. So the main tool which Ukrainians see as the way out of the conflict were diplomatic tools. Around 55%, constantly plus minus several percent, were always in favor of diplomatic means, meaning that Ukraine should try to compromise, but not at any price. So, for instance, territorial concessions were not on agenda for Ukrainian society after 2014. But as of now, we have vice versa situation, and neither Ukrainian society believe that diplomacy will work with Russia, nor majority of Ukrainian partners, despite the fact that last year, lots of them started to find the option how to save face for Putin, how to find a compromise, and this issue might appear again on agenda. But generally, the actions of the Putin, starting from his public speeches and ending with the activity of Putin forces on the ground, they are proving the opposite, that Russia is not seeking for constructive negotiations and is not going to withdraw from Ukrainian forces, from Ukrainian land under no circumstances. But the problem now is that Russia is still not satisfied, even with what it has grabbed. And of course, for Ukraine, it's too much, and this is an unaffordable price to speak about. So that's why diplomacy is not actually the main tool, unfortunately, for Ukrainian armed forces, but this is the reality. The third important difference is that Ukraine has received no military support in 2014. Actually, Crimea and the occupation of Donbas was another element after Georgian war, after Russian invasion of Transnistria back in the 90s, after Russian 2 wars against Chechnya, against Ichkeria. So West actually swallowed up everything which Russia did around former Soviet Union. And in 2022, Russian side really thought that the reaction would be the same, and they were mistaken, but mistaken first and foremost due to the resilience and repel of Russia's attacks demonstrated by Ukrainians. If Ukrainians didn't fight without enough weapons, without tanks, without armored vehicles, without enough skilled people back at the end of February last year, no one would help Ukraine. And this is the reality of the situation. But fortunately, Ukraine appeared to be seriously different from what we were in 2014. We didn't, I think, as a society, we didn't expect that we would have a sustainable peace with Russia, and we expected that some kind of aggression will be again. But we were mistaken only with the expectation that the scope of this aggression would be so large. Most of the experts, most of the politicians believe that this kind of aggression will be limited to specific part of Ukrainian territory, namely for the Donbas, because the large-scale invasion which we have seen didn't seem to be rational from our point of view for Putin, but they have their own rationality. As Putin said today in his address to the Federal Assembly, that historically Russian land, which was always a part of Russian Federation, of Russian state, and which is now called Ukraine, is occupied and has to be returned to Russia. So we understand now that this is actually how Russia sees the Ukrainian war, actually the Russian war, which Russia is waging against Ukraine. And this is why Ukraine cannot simply compromise about giving up its territories, about restricting its political sovereignty. I don't hear you.
Thank you, Mariia. Those are great points, and I'm going to definitely come back to you on this issue of the public mood and what that means in terms of making peace at the end of the day. But let's first go back to both Andreis, and I'll start with Andrii Yarmolskyi, of course, this time. Andrei, one of your roles is on the interdepartmental working group on the implementation of state sanctions policy. Can you tell us about Ukraine's sanctions policy against Russian individuals and companies, its goals and effectiveness, and zoom in on how those sanctions also impact on the Ukrainian economy and businesses? Thank you, Andrei.
Thank you. Hello to everybody. Yes, National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine is a coordinating body in the field of national security and defense, which also includes the sanction policy. I should admit that like weapons and gun in the battlefield, the sanction policy is a kind of weapon in the political front, and we try to make the sanction influence to aggressor more crucial. And we had some information before the start of the war, and our NSDC department made some measure. We tried to eliminate the bad influence of Russia propaganda to Ukrainian media, so we imposed sanctions to a lot of Russian channels, and we analyzed our Ukrainian collaborators that tried to make good picture for aggressors. So we imposed them under the sanction too, and after the full-scale invasion of the focus of Ukrainian sanction a little bit changed, because we tried to weaken our enemy, and the main categories that we sanction is military-industrial complex. It's Russian oligarchs, because they play very important role of financing the war, and Russian propagandists, of course, and other enterprises that take part in financing the war industrial complex of Russia. And we pay a lot of attention how to synchronize our efforts with our partners like United Kingdom, USA, EU, in order to make the influence of sanction more more crucial. And we have a lot of information that Russian oligarchs that have business in Ukraine and UK and in USA use their income in order to support Russian troops, and the issue of screening investment are very important for us, because we have facts that Russian oligarchs bought a lot of critical infrastructure companies in Ukraine, not for purpose of getting income, but in order to control some very important spheres in our economy. So we should eliminate this such bad influence to our economy. The separate direction of sanction policy of Ukraine is the seizure of assets of Russian oligarchs. The anti-corruptional court of Ukraine is the body which is responsible for that, and our Ministry of Justice applied to the court, and we have some successful cases concerning Deripaska, Shilkov, Yevtushenkov, and Ukrainian previous President Yanukovych. And I should admit that it's a start, and we have a lot of information about Hryban, about Alpha Group, about Abramovich and others, and the next cases will be connected with such names. Of course, Ukrainian sanctions restrictions have bad influence to Ukrainian economy, because Ukrainian economy naturally were connected with Russian one, but I I should admit that Ukrainian business suffer not because of sanctions, but because of military aggression of Russia. And that's why we try to cooperate our actions with our partners more closely in order to stop Russian to cut their income to their budgets and in order they don't have any opportunities how to lead this war in the future, and in order to stop their ways, how to get the finance for this military aggression. This is the main goal for sanction policy of Ukraine.
Thank you, Andrii. We'll ask you some more questions on that shortly. Let's turn to Andrii Zuez also now. In terms of your role on the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, presumably you don't simply discuss the traditional hard military questions or hard security issues, but I presume that this issue of what's happening in the economy is also coming up quite a bit. Now, given how Russia is deliberately targeting Ukraine's key infrastructure, what is the current status of your energy sector? How does that impact on your ability to fight this war? And so let's maybe start with that, Andrii. Thank you. Did you hear that, Andrii?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, we had a very huge shelling from Russian side last few months, and especially on energy sectors and energy plants and energy objects. It will be damaged, but not so critically. And for now, we return to our usual regime of energy working sector for now. And we extremely increased our anti-shelling systems, of course, with the help of our partners from the West. It's systems like Hawk, and we have C-300, quite enough amount of the shells. And against the strike drones, we use Gepard. It's a Dutch war machine with a special machine gun against moving air targets. And so for now, it's not so critical as it used to be a few months ago. And with the further help of the partners, we wait for Patriots, of course. We are very expect for this to happen. I think we will close the sky quite successfully in the next few months.
I'm very glad about your optimism, and I hope I hope part of that also comes from the special visit you had yesterday by President Biden. Of course, maybe you can tell us something about the mood in Ukraine, about the visit related to President Biden. And then maybe a related question to that. NATO recently made a number of commitments to Ukraine. What are the highlights of those new commitments? And more importantly, where are the major gaps in terms of supplies?
Okay, I think Joe Biden brought us a high mood, of course. because he's a very strong guy, not to be afraid to visit the country during the war. And by the way, in Kiev streets with our president. So there were airstrike threat from Belarus side. One of the air jets flew up, and alarm was of course working, and warning everyone in Kiev that it's danger. He brought a huge package of assistance, military assistance, which is highly in need for our troops. And I want to comment something that must connect to your question to these issues. Despite a big announcement of Russian invasion, full-scale invasion, we still do not feel any significant offensive of Russian forces. Russia has concentrated about future impact, and of course we must prepare for this. And but what we see, what our intelligence services gives us as information, that they are poorly armed, bad trained, and completely demotivated. They don't know what they fight for in Ukraine, really, and no one tells. It's still a huge amount of the soldiers, so of course we must be aware. And as you know, our tactic, we protect our people. We are very carefully planning our operations, and I think in the next 3 months we will there will be a series of our offensives, of course, and I think from Russian side there will be attempt of counter-offensives, because we know for sure that they are already aware about our plans to make an impact, to make the offensive. So concerning to NATO issues, what we do need extremely now, of course, it's weapon, and again weapon. We need, if it's comfortable to say in this audience, I can mention some positions. What we need. You just tell me, is it comfortable? Is it politically correct in this audience? I can tell you.
You can tell us exactly what you need. You are in Ukraine and you know what you need.
All right. Then, as I said before, and as my colleague said here, we will push out the Russian troops out of territory of Ukraine. But war will not end at this point, because Russia in its condition, in its current condition, never will refuse from conquering Ukraine, because there is no empire without Ukraine. It's quite understandable. So to change the situation, to let Ukraine win, we should bring a political collapse of the Russian regime, and it only can be possible while the military defeat of Russian troops. And there are a huge amount of weapons we do need for this. For example, we need long-range missile systems, 150 kilometers plus. We need armored vehicles for offensive. We need modern aviation, kind of F-16 to cover our offensive from the air and neutralize Russian aviation, which contains about 400 air jets for now. We need artillery systems and rounds to them, shells, because now the advantage of Russian in artillery is 1-6. So we have 1, they have 6. It's very bad for us. We need radars for counter-battery combat. We need strike drones for the long-range distance. This is, we extremely need to change the situation to make first few steps towards our victory.
Thank you. Thank you for spelling that out also. And of course, the fact that you mentioned there that you're outnumbered 6-1, of course, which also speaks to the dire needs of Ukraine. Let's turn to Mariia also. Mariia, there are, of course, different perceptions in the US and the EU, and in the EU, you can perhaps differentiate even between the eastern and western flanks of the EU with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. How are those perceptions influencing Western policymaking and commitments towards Ukraine?
On the one hand, the whole coalition, let's say, of Ukrainian partners in the West, starting from our Western borders and up to actually Australia, Japan, and US. So this is not just Western Europe plus Canada and US. On the one hand, this large and broad coalition has never been united so strongly as they are united around the idea to make Ukraine win. On the other hand, there are, of course, differences. The most hawkish nations and states in response to Russian security threat are, of course, eastern flank of NATO, Baltic states and Poland. Their hawkishness, let's say, is demonstrated by this very strict position that, first of all, Ukraine has to occupy its entire territory without any simulations or any speculations around that. So the idea that Crimea might be left occupied or part of Donbas might be left occupied is never considered as a proper or reasonable end of the war by any governmental or non-governmental actors, neither in Poland nor in one of the Baltic states. The second reason for that, the second element here is that Ukraine has to become, from their point of view, a member of NATO as soon as possible, and has to be given specific guarantees, maybe even additionally to the NATO membership. And these countries, especially Poland, they are not just saying, but they are actually exhausting their stockpiles at the maximum possible, doing their best to send everything which they can to Ukraine. And the same are doing smaller nations like Latvia and Estonia, despite the fact that they are under the much more serious threat in case Ukraine is, in case Ukraine doesn't have any success in repelling Russia's attack. And fourth difference here in this regard is that these countries are actually like front runners in terms of pushing others to go forward with new types of support to Ukraine, which hasn't yet been demonstrated to Ukraine. But this eastern flank is actually not just limited to Eastern Europe. It is joined by the United Kingdom, which is doing actually extraordinary both diplomatic and military policy in order to push others. And while somebody was joking, somebody's out of Putin verstehers were joking for the just 14th Challenger tanks, we all understand that that kind of decision was just to break the political taboo, which was present among Western partners of Ukraine when it came to the tanks. And that taboo was broken, and we had a decision of Leopards later. Another group of our partners, namely like countries of old Europe, let's say, so actually the founders of the European Union, they are more cautious about not just making Ukraine win, but they are more cautious in terms of what will be with Russia if Ukraine is undoubtedly win and regain the control over the entire territory. And here is just another, portion of work to be done, because these countries used to coexist with Russia, used to trade with Russia, and they might seem to be less hawkish than Poland or UK, for instance. But if we compare Germany 1 year ago and Germany now, these are like two different countries. The debates within the government, when some parties like Greens, they are just strongly in favor of giving Ukraine all needed military support. German society has changed a lot, and actually the changes within German society, which supported military support to Ukraine, pushed actually the Social Democrats, all after all, in together with other factors, but it was an important domestic signal to government that they have to react to some changing perceptions of what is Russia, what is Ukraine, and how to make Ukraine win. And third group of, or third component in this like puzzle, let's say, of a bit various in terms of their positions, Ukraine's partners, is US, which is anyway the main military donor, the main front runner in terms of, keeping this Western large coalition together diplomatically. They were also, I would say that there is also a dynamics of how US was perceiving the situation. And we have some positive signals for Ukraine as well, because from the idea that Ukraine will win, but Ukraine has to decide on its own what is the victory, we have come up to the point which was announced by Antony Blinken at Munich Security Conference, that the most sustainable formula of peace is that Ukraine regains the control over its entire territory. And that's very important. So it's a clear signal. And we see that even when some countries like France are sending controversial controversial messages to save, some kind of channel of communication with Russia, not to make Russia be defeated. On the other hand, France is sending heavy weapons to Ukraine and making Ukraine defeat Russia. And I have my last but not least point here is that the diplomacy now is just behind the developments on the military battlefield. And as soon as Ukraine starts showing others, in addition to Kharkiv, to Kherson developments and counteroffensive, starts showing this year some other, even local, but effective, successful counteroffensive results, the less will be, the fewer will be those people around political elites in the West who would still think about compromising with Russia, speaking about making some political deal, and the more will be understanding, the stronger will be understanding that Russia has to be deprived of all the means, not only military, but also nuclear and economic, to constitute a threat for Ukraine, for Baltic states, for Poland in the future.
Thank you, Mariia. I think your point is well taken, that the facts on the battleground will, of course, also determine how some of your international allies and partners will also respond to this particular situation. Let's turn again to Andrii Yarmolskyi. Andrii, SpaceX recently said it will restrict Starlink. What has so far been the significance of Starlink to Ukraine, and what other alternatives are there to fill the gap should Starlink pull the plug completely? Thank you.
Thank you. 3 days after the full-scale invasion of Russia, SpaceX launched Starlink service support in Ukraine and sent the first batch of terminals. Today, we have more than 10,000 Starlink terminals in Ukraine, and more than 3,000 terminals were provided by SpaceX free of charge, and we're grateful for that. and American agency, governmental agency USAID also helped with procurement and delivery. We also received Starlink terminals from the US, EU, and other partners. And today, the Starlink satellite communication platform project of the SpaceX company has already registered as a legal entity in Ukraine. And I believe that they see the future in Ukraine. You know, since the beginning of hostilities of Ukraine, Starlink terminals have provided high-speed internet in Ukraine cities, upload speed of about 150 megabits per second, and you know, a lot of Ukrainian regions that suffered from catastrophic destruction due to airstrikes and shelling by the Russian occupation forces have the connection to internet. Starlink also provides an opportunity to stay connected in places where there is no any alternative, and because of fixed and mobile internet is down due to damage or power outages. And today we use Starlink station in the schools, in fire departments, in state institutions, banks, and so on. I should admit that armed forces of Ukraine may use the constant internet provided by SpaceX only in connection purposes, not because of military purposes. So I believe that all regulatory restriction of using Starlink in wartime have been lifted. So now anyone in Ukraine who wants may pay officially the Starlink station and install the terminal and use the internet connection and pay for that. Currently, Ukraine has a sufficient number of alternative ways how to get the internet, but we have some analogs of the satellite internet system, but we have two problems. The first one, two problematic aspects maybe. The first one is the price, and the second one, the speed of installation of such equipment. You know, time is very valuable for us, especially at the battlefield, and the constant internet access is critical. Of course, we have some satellite radio connections, but a lot of military weapon needs internet connection. So I believe that satellite internet system like Starlink is indispensable in terms of speed and quality. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrii. I think those are really interesting issues that you raised there, and the importance of Starlink, of course, also you know, contributing to Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but also in the day-to-day operations, you know, in the economy and how it affects ordinary individuals. Let's turn again to Andrii Zuez again. Andrii, there's a lot of talk about a spring offensive, both by Ukraine and Russia, and I think recently NATO also claimed already that we're witnessing the start of another already of a Russian offensive. What is Ukraine anticipating for the coming months, and what should we be looking out for? Thank you, Andrii.
What we expect in the next few months is, of course, Russia offensive actions and also our offensive actions. I cannot tell about the details because it's classified data about our offensive plans, but for sure, it will be And I think the decidable point in this issue is how many weapon we will get for this offensive, as I previously mentioned, those numbers and those positions. And by the way, I must say and inform you that Russian army also began to feel experience a shortage of artillery ammunition. This is for sure. But they have friends. They have North Korea. They have Iran. They count on them, and they have probably China. We still don't understand what the issue of purpose from China side this last few days done to Russian side, and we have to be very careful with that. So personally, I don't see any significant events on the battlefield next few months. I mean, for Ukraine, bad for Ukraine, extremely bad for Ukraine. Our soldiers, yes, they're tired, of course, because they're dying and they're getting very tired. Yeah, especially when they don't see any significant changes and some visible events on the front line. So a lot of things depends on weapon, and this is what we are expecting for.
Thank you. May I also, oops,
yeah.
Apologies. Go ahead, Andrii.
Yes, I just wanted to mention about key battles we held in last few months. Is Solidar, as you heard, as you know, and now it's Bakhmut. It's a kind of fortress which we hold the most because it's not about it's not about the city. Yes, it's about signing that we can win. We can we can strike. We can do powerful impacts on Russian towards Russian troops. So tactically, it's
of huge value.
Yeah, huge value of this city, of course, but it's quite significantly for our future victories. So
Thank you,
all we
Andrii.
need is three things for now. Three things we need. We need weapon, we need weapon, and we need weapon.
Of course, yes.
And everything will be all right. The rest will be done by our brave soldiers.
Thank you. No. I think, of course, Deputy Minister will also remind us that there's also a need for support for the economy, of course, which is so closely linked to it, as he said earlier. I'm glad you rejoined the discussion also. I'm going to circle back to you momentarily. Let me just ask Mariia one thing first. Mariia, earlier you mentioned this poll, and I believe it was conducted by Ilko Kucherev, which you are, of course, affiliated with. And the results came out in mid-December last year. What did that poll mean in terms of, what's your reading of the main observations of the public mood, and how, more importantly, how do you think will that impact on the ongoing conflict and the future of Ukraine? Thank you, Mariia.
Well, I'm a big advocate to include public opinion as a factor into public policy making. And that was the case with previously occupied Donbas and Crimea, and how we insisted, for instance, in 2015, 2016, that Ukraine should not agree to any kind of restriction of Ukraine's political sovereignty, like we were sometimes advised by some Western politicians, exactly because they couldn't be legitimized by Ukrainian society. And now we have, yes, it was another public opinion poll, which was not the first, it was third, I suppose, in a row, on all the territories which are controlled by Ukrainian state as of now. And there are several very important, briefly, several important findings and takeouts. So first of all, the level of certainty about Ukrainian victory over Russia is not only decreasing, not decreasing, but it has even increased by several percent in comparison to summer 2022. As of now, 93% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine is winning and is capable of winning over Russia. Second important finding is that Ukraine is no longer believing that Russia will stick to any kind of a political deal. And even despite the fact that Ukraine is sacrificing its lives, the only way is to defeat Russian army. So more than 60% believe that Ukraine shouldn't go into political negotiations with Russia as of now. Third important conclusion, Ukrainians do believe that Ukraine should be a part of some kind of collective security model. It can be NATO, which is definitely a priority, which is supported by 50% of the population. So just not to confuse anyone, because people usually hear some numbers like over 80% or something. If you ask people directly, do you support membership of Ukraine in NATO, you will receive 85% of support. But we just measured, and we do it regularly. We measure different options to make people believe. This is like an additional attempt to find out what people are going to support. And NATO is 100% like priority number one. 50% of the people are in favor of NATO membership. Others, several options, are different types of defense alliances with partners, like either with eastern flank of NATO or with US, like some kind of strategic partnership in the field of security and defense. The idea of non-bloc status or non-alignment status of Ukraine has never had such a small number of adherents, just around 8%. I just remind that before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, non-bloc status was considered by relative majority of Ukrainians, around 45%, as the main option to guarantee national security of Ukraine. And the reality make Ukrainians think rational and actually support other types of security cooperation, meaning NATO and the defense alliances. And of course, the last but not the least takeout is that regardless of region of residence, regardless of the level of education, and even regardless of how rich or poor the specific group is. So Ukrainians do believe that this kind of peace at any price, just to forget about territories, whatever, is not possible. As of now, the image of victory, we measured it, is like 55% think that Ukraine should regain control over its entire territory, including, of course, Crimea and previously occupied Donbas. 22% goes even beyond just restoration of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and say that Ukraine has to destroy Russian army to the extent that it has never, constitute any kind of threat to Ukraine anymore, or that, somehow support the solution of Russia. So as of now, for instance, territorial concessions at the coast of Crimea is supported just by 7% of Ukrainians. And it should be kept in mind while developing the strategy towards Russia, that in case someone will dare, I would say even, to try to impose some kind of diplomatic so-called peace deals to Ukraine, they will receive will not only receive no stable peace, they will receive delegitimization of authorities in Ukraine and domestic troubles.
Thank you, Mariia. And of course, that's going to have a huge impact on not only what happens on the battleground, but also if there's any talk about what the final peace deal would look like under current conditions. I don't know, I just noticed that, Deputy Minister, you might have a small problem with your connection there, but if you can hear us, would love to hear, we have a question for you. Seizing Russian frozen assets and using those funds to pay to rebuild Ukraine is tricky, but it seems like it's not impossible. Can you provide us with an update in terms of using Russian assets to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine?
Sure, yeah, I can hear you. I think my camera is acting a bit funky.
You're good.
So that's why I'm switching it off from time to time. But this is a very important question indeed, and I would here separate it in two major streams. The Russian assets that can be that are frozen and can be potentially seized abroad, and the Russian assets that are still maintained on the territory of Ukraine. So these are like the two separate tracks. And the first track, of course, it's where we fully rely and depend on the other governments, and that's where it's becoming very difficult, because this is like still associated with the intervention to the private property, and to my mind, whatever belongs to the state of Russia should be a low-hanging fruit, but it's perceived differently because the governments are usually still the members of these international treaties, whatever. So this is more like getting down to the whole system and the framework of the world security and geopolitical security, supported even by the fact that Russia is still the active member of the National Security International Security Council in the United Nations. So that's it may seem as a joke sometimes, but it is what it is, and the governments actually have to international governments, foreign governments have to stick to these rules. We do have some good examples, like for instance, the Parliament of Canada voted that whatever assets going to be frozen can be seized and can actually be provided as a source of funds to support Ukraine, and this is the way to do it. We know that recently the Swiss government has frozen the huge amount of funds on the accounts in the Swiss banks, but will they ever be seized? Nobody knows. We know that the European Union's idea is on this stage until they find a way how to seize the assets, try to seize the proceeds from these assets and see how this can go. And because I can also imagine that some of those luxury assets actually the heavy burden, because you need to maintain the expensive yachts, or the houses in order for them to preserve in the value. So it's much better to start getting some money rather than be spending the money on them. And I think this will be another big discussion point, and maybe an argument in our favor that the governments will take eventually the decision that these assets should be redirected to support Ukraine. We know the examples of the UK government, for instance, with Abramovich and sort of like an amicable deal to contribute Chelsea Football Club to support Ukraine. And we know that there were attempts, to generalize this whole approach, and he wanted to provide the money to support, like to fight the violence all over the world, to fight the war consequences all over the world. But look, what are we talking about? Like the biggest war in Europe is happening, and Abramovich was the one who was supporting Putin all the time and the regime. You want to support nivellate the consequences of other war conflicts in the world. Let's fix this one first. So we see that the UK government is actually working closely in this directions with us. So we hope that these funds will be also available because it's a pretty substantial amount that the football club was sold at. And this needs like another governance. This needs another push from all the directions, both for publicity, you know, like the journalists, the society. Everybody should be raising this issue because it cannot be, you know, like the decision cannot be taken on the usual rules of the game, because the game was broken, you know. So there's no longer the game. So it's like totally different paradigm that we now all live in. And the sooner everybody understands this, the better it will be, because the sooner we will fight the Putin's regime, and the sooner we'll be able to try to get back to the normal life, because everybody's suffering. The whole world is suffering from this war. And the only way to put it to bed is actually to end the war. This is the only way to do it. And that's why I totally agree with Andrii when he says we need weapons and funds as the sources for these weapons. And it's actually being discussed everywhere, and everybody's now agrees with this concept that the war has reached this critical point where we actually have no other chance. And the longer we gonna hesitate, and the longer the whole community is dragging with a decision, the more expensive eventually it's going to be in terms of human lives, in terms of funds that are going to be spent on this whole campaign. So the international seizure of the assets that are frozen internationally is a whole of a big issue, and so the more attention is around it, the better. And I hope we're going to get somewhere. What relates to Ukraine, it's actually the National State and Defense and Security Council. Both Andriis are taking care of this, and we're actually quite successful in imposing sanctions and freezing the assets and seizing them eventually. Recently, there was a big one where the titanium assets that belonged to one of the Russian oligarchs were seized and now going to be connected to another state-owned enterprise, and that's why we try to make very attractive privatization objects. So because we don't want to nationalize these assets for the sake of the state being the manager, because we know previously from the history that the Ukrainian state is probably not the best asset manager, and that's why we want the international business to pay attention to these assets. So we're seizing them and nationalizing them, not for the sake of maintaining them, but for the sake of making them available for the much broader community. Because before, under the Russia's influence, there were some preferences to the guys called oligarchs here in Ukraine. And this is obviously not the way we want to continue. Our president is firmly stated and also showed and depicted that his way of doing the policy and developing is this de-oligarchization. So we want this all be back into the national Ukraine's hands, state's hands, in order to be fairly privatized, attracting the Western business, attracting like international business practices, big investors with expertise, with the much cheaper cost of capital, with the different approach of running business. So that's our goal. So that's how we want to impose it and do this.
Thank you. And it will be interesting to see in the months ahead how much this case of Ukraine and trying to get access to those assets, how that will impact on the broader issue of international law and the ability to confiscate those assets. Thank you so much to all 5 of our speakers. We unfortunately ran out of time. I'd like to thank both Andreis, also sitting in the same virtual room, joining us from Kiev. Also, Oleksandr Hryban, also thank you for your wonderful contributions and for coming back to us following your other meeting, as well as Mariia Zolkina and Olga Tokariuk in her absence. Also, thank you for all your contributions. We will, of course, continue to track the Russia-Ukraine war and do our best to focus on the consequences thereof. I'd like to also ask our audience to join us in 2 weeks to discuss how this war is impacting on NATO. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.